Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the South Shore Sports Show. I'm Jason Snow with Chris McDaniel and Ryan Vermette. And guys, it was a fun Thanksgiving, but this might be the most highly anticipated week of high school football that we have, right? I mean, Super Bowl week, we have four South Shore teams in it, a couple of Vogue State championships this week as well that we're going to touch on. Lots to be excited about.
Definitely, and it's looking like a great slate of Super Bowls. And Thanksgiving is great. It's great to have everybody out there on the field one last time. And there's some great rivalries. We had Plymouth North, Plymouth South playing at Fenway Park, and an unforgettable overtime game that we'll talk about a little bit here. But nothing beats the Super Bowl at Gillette Stadium.
Yeah, we have Scituate in it. We have Norwell in Division 6 making their first state championship appearance since 1999. We have Cohasset in Division 7, and we have Randolph in Division 8. But Chris, you want to give out some game balls from Thanksgiving first?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm gonna go to Hanover. I'm gonna cut my game ball in half here. I'm gonna give half to Colin Arnold, who threw for 260 yards and 4 TDs against Norwell in a 49-8 win. And his favorite target, a name we've talked about a lot, was Brandon Erica, who had 8 catches for 226 yards, 2 touchdowns. Also had an 85-yard kickoff return for his touchdown. Arnold was injured early in the season and missed most of the season. I think last week was his first game back at quarterback since going out with the injury, and he ended his career on a real high note. Had a great final game there.
Where are you going, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm going with Milton quarterback Patrick Collins. He threw 4 touchdown passes on a 31-0 win over Braintree on Thanksgiving, and it wasn't just the 4 touchdowns. He broke the single season record, for touchdowns in program history with 35. So it was just a fitting way for a team that had such a great season. It was just a fitting end for not only Collins but a nice win for Milton there. So he gets my game ball for setting that history down there in Milton.
Yeah, I'm going with Timmy DeRocher from Plymouth South. Threw for a touchdown, ran for 3 touchdowns, accounted for all 4 scores in 27-21 overtime win over Plymouth North at Fenway Park. And I just put myself in his shoes. I mean, what a way to end your high school football career and maybe your football career altogether. I know, he was kind of uncertain if he was going to play in college at the beginning of the season. But what an unforgettable way to get it done, and over your long-standing rival at that. I mean, you can't make it up any better than that.
Yeah, definitely. And we always talk about how there are certain games where it kind of doesn't really matter how good or bad the teams are. You're gonna be in a close game, and I think Plymouth North, Plymouth South has always been emblematic of that. And I know both teams had good seasons, went to the playoffs this year, and we're pretty on par with each other. But I think even in years where it seems like it's been a little bit more lopsided, that game always finds a way to be close and be super entertaining. Yeah, but we'll switch gears here, and we'll jump right into the Super Bowl talk. We'll just go in order of when the games are going to be played. So, the first Super Bowl, which I think is actually going to be one of the more intriguing matchups of the 8 games, is a Division 7 game. Number 2 Amesbury, who's 12-0, is taking on number 1 Cohasset, who's 10-2. Amesbury's won 13 games in a row. They've outscored opponents 422 to 127. They've got some notable wins, and I think kind of similar to Cohasset, they've played teams that are kind of above their weight class, and they've handled those matchups pretty well. And Amesbury's been a team that's been in this state title picture the last couple of years here. So these are 2 teams that I think have probably had eyes on each other a little bit the last couple of years. But Jason, what are you kind of looking for when you look at this matchup?
Yeah, I think this is a Cohasset team that we've been high on all year long. They've been dominant through postseason play, defeating 3 opponents. Northbridge, a team that has the state's all-time winningest coach. We highlighted that as potentially a game to watch and maybe an upset scare for Cohasset. Beat them pretty handily in the Final Four. Rockland, I was there covering that one. Gus Green had a couple of touchdowns, and then Leicester. And Gus Green, he's a name that we've mentioned many times on this podcast. Now the owner of the school's single-season touchdown record with 27. This is not going to be an easy game by any stretch for either of these teams. I think it's going to go down to the wire. But I think the key is going to be up front for Cohasset. If Dan Baker and Nick Astor can dominate and establish themselves on the outside of that line and get pressure on the quarterback and collapse the pocket, I think the Cohasset defense can, put on a little bit of a show here, and that's going to be, I think, the way to get it done. Ground and pound with Gus Green, and hopefully the linemen up front stand tall.
Chris, you mentioned at the beginning, you said this might be one of the more intriguing matchups, and I totally agree. And not that all 8 Super Bowls, right? You're in a Super Bowl, so it should be a pretty close game, anyway, right? We would think, but I think out of all of our South Shore matchups here, the teams that made it from our area, I feel like this is just one that just screams like it's going to be a real intense, close, great game at Gillette. And how about Cohasset, by the way, going for it on Thanksgiving, starting their guys, playing Mike Wildfire on Thanksgiving. So, I know that was a conversation we were talking about, but, credit to them for, trying to keep the guys rolling, and we'll see what happens against an undefeated Amesbury team.
Yeah, and I think when you kind of look at this game, there's so many different names that I think could kind of walk away as the quote-unquote Super Bowl MVP. If you look at Amesbury, they've got 4 different players who scored at least 9 touchdowns so far this year, according to the Newburyport News. That's Joe Salia, Joe Pulio, Connor Scaldone, and Justin Dube, the quarterback. They run a straight T formation, which is kind of like an I formation with a third running back. So, Amesbury's going to look to have those 12, 13 play drives where Cohasset could win with the passing game. They could win with the running game. Gus Green's could go over 2,000 rushing yards in the season in this one. Mike Wildfire has, over 1,500 passing yards already. So we've talked a lot about Cohasset's balance. So there's a couple different ways that Cohasset can win this game. But, from seeing these games at Gillette over the years, usually early December, you're going to be cold. There might be some wet conditions. They're not usually conducive to passing elements at the high school level. It's, like Jason was saying, usually it's going to be the team that's more physical up front that controls the game and that can make the difference. So, I just think that this game can play out a lot of different ways with a lot of different potential heroes. And, it could be the type of game where Amesbury has a 15-play drive and it's like, Cohasset's in trouble. And 3 plays later, Cohasset's got 3 30-yard plays and they've tied it up, and you don't really know what you're going to expect the rest of the way. So, when I look at this one, I think this is one of those games that, is probably one of the most coin flip type games that you'll see at Gillette this year.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if it is kind of a go back and forth, kind of ugly game. It's kind of 14-14 late third quarter. How's this game gonna break open? And then all of a sudden, Mike Wildfire hits Nolan Flaherty over the top, or Max Monahan makes a big play. He had a pick 6 in the Rockland game a few weeks ago. I think you're right on the money, Chris. This is a game where there are faces on either side, even some that can slide under the radar a little bit, that can still make an impact and be that memorable figure from this game. I think you're on the money there.
We talk about it all year that Cohasset plays hot teams in higher divisions to be challenged for this. And I think on a skill level, Cohasset can hang with just about anybody in the South Shore, regardless of division. But that physicality up front is kind of the difference. And I think that's why you see them play Division 6 Norwell, who's in the Super Bowl. They play Silver Lake, who's in Division 3. Plymouth North was a Division 2 playoff team. North Quincy was a Division 2 playoff team. And, skill-wise, Cohasset is, likely better than those teams. But I think the reason they play those games is because they're used to that. They want to get used to that physicality up front, because they're going to run into a team like Amesbury who wants to grind out the game the entire second half. They want to have those 15-play drives, and Cohasset is used to playing those teams with those bigger linemen, trying to figure out how can they get an advantage, how can they match up with that kind of size up front. So I think Cohasset is about as prepared as anybody in Division 7 to play a team like Amesbury. But I do worry about the weather a little bit, if that kind of forces Cohasset to be a little bit more one-dimensional than they want to be. But when I look at this game, I just feel like Cohasset has more routes to victory. And I would be pretty surprised if we look up in the fourth quarter and it's 28-7 Amesbury. But if it's 28-7 Cohasset, I'm not going to be surprised. I'm expecting more of a close game. That's probably going to come down to maybe who has the ball last in a game like this. But I just feel like Cohasset has more routes to victory in this one. Yeah,
and honestly, that we how strong Cohasset has been. It also says a lot about Randolph, considering that Randolph squeaked out a regular season victory against them um, late in the year. And even Pete Fanisu, after the game against Rockland in the postseason, said if this team unleashes at its full potential physically up front, it's one of the best that he's had in 20 years. And he knows a lot better than me. I haven't been around for that long, but it's easy to see why. They've been just on this roll in the playoffs. They were ready for it, and they're ready for the moment.
Yeah, and Peter Fanisu, one of the better coaches in the area, and he's the type of guy that likes to chew on nuts and screws. So they're going to be ready for this one up front. They're not gonna get bowled over in a game like this, especially where they know exactly what's coming at them on the other side. So, I still like Cohasset in this game. What way are you guys leaning on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely lean Cohasset. I feel like this is kind of their year to kind of pull it off. I mean, it's tough saying that when there's names for a team that's won 13 in a row, they're undefeated, and they're just outscoring their opponents by an insane margin. It's tough to say that, but I do believe, like you said, Chris, I think just the way that Cohasset's offense is balanced, and if they can do enough defensively to kind of stop that T formation, that tricky T that Amesbury runs, I think it should definitely go in Cohasset's favor. So I'm going to take them in this one.
Make it a clean sweep. Yeah, I would go Cohasset in this one. Like I said, it's going to be a closely contested game. There's going to be one play that breaks this open, in my opinion. But if I were a betting man, I'd say Cohasset makes that play.
Yeah, and like we said, even though all three of us are going on Cohasset, maybe with our kind of skipper colored glasses here, but I think there's going to be one of the more intriguing Super Bowl games that has a chance to be really exciting, and could come down to the final couple minutes. Moving on to the nightcap on Thursday in Division 6, you've got number 3 Fairhaven, who's 11-1 against number 1 Norwell, who's 9-3. Jason, give me an over/under on how many passes we're going to see in this game.
10 and a half. Not many. I don't think we're going to see a heck of a ton.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna take the under on that number, and these are two teams that are kind of built to play football this time of year at Gillette Stadium. Earlier I was talking about how weather can kind of be an issue in some of these games, and usually it's going to come down to who's more physical up front, who can run the ball and avoid the mistakes. But what are the kind of key points that jump out to you in this game? You've got two teams that feels like they've kind of been circling each other for a couple of years here in Division 6, and now they're going to meet at the ultimate stage. But there is a little bit of history here.
Yeah, Ryan, you saw Norwell in person, as did I. But I think the difference is going to be up front, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about their offensive line and their run game all season long, and it's just nobody's figured out how to stop Jack Lucarelli yet, and there's a reason why they're in the Super Bowl. It's because mainly of him in that offense. So at this point, if nobody's figured it out yet, then I don't think anybody will, and I think that's just going to end up being the difference. He's just going to do whatever he wants to these defenses, and I mean to amass over he's probably going to reach or get close to 3,000 yards in this game, and the fact that he still left room to get close to 1,000 passing yards when he's rushed for over 2,000 yards is still pretty impressive to have all those carries and all those rushing yards and still almost throw 1,000. So I mean it's going to be in front. Can't forget about Colin Gerhardt, who could kind of be an X factor in this game for that offense. If for whatever reason Lucarelli has a quote unquote off game, right? He's approaching 1,000 yards a season himself, so he could kind of be someone who flies under the radar as maybe an unsung hero in this game if things don't go exactly to plan. But I think it really just comes down to nobody stopped him yet, so I don't see it happening anytime soon. To me, it's just that simple, Jason.
And kind of setting the scene here, Fairhaven, this is their third consecutive trip to the Super Bowl. They won in 2023 that year when they were the number 8 seed. They upset number 1 Norwell. And Norwell is a team that I think every year we've kind of looked at the start of the season and been like, this could be the year that Norwell breaks through and reaches the Super Bowl. And this was finally that year. It felt like, that really could have happened any of the last 3 years. They've been right there at the top of Division 6, and this was kind of the year they were able to break through. And it looked a little doubtful there against Hudson in the semifinals a couple weeks ago. They were down 7-0 and heading into the fourth quarter, and then the defense kind of won that game for them, which I think we've talked all season about Jack Lucarelli in the running game for Norwell, but for them to have that added element of the defense being something that can kind of step up for them, because they're going to need probably their best defensive effort in this one. Grant Damifol and Aaron Legg have rushed for combined 37 touchdowns this year. Fairhaven's a team that, they're going to run right at you the entire game between the tackles for the most part, and Fairhaven is a little bit of a surprise to be here. I think if you were to go back to the preseason, obviously they went to consecutive Super Bowls, but, the leading the way for them was Justin Marks, who was, probably the state's most accomplished runner and ever when it comes to what he was able to do statistically, winning a Super Bowl and getting back to a Super Bowl last season. So, I think it's a little bit of a surprise that Fairhaven's here, but they come from a tough league, that their only loss was to West Bridgewater during the regular season in kind of a crazy 47-43 game. But, this is going to be a really fun one. And I think, I do expect it to be close, but I like the way that Norwell's playing right now. And I think that Hudson win where they were able to win and with defense, there was a couple of big passing plays in the fourth quarter. I think it just unlocked a new element for Norwell outside of just, Jack Lucarelli kind of, putting on his Superman cape and taking over.
Chris,
right. Go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry, Jason. Chris, I just want to ask you real quick, with the way these two teams operate, especially with the offenses, does this feel like a game where if someone jumps out by 2 scores, 14-0, 10-0, does it seem like whoever's on the wrong end of that start, it might be tough for them to kind of get back into the game, I guess, just with the way that these two teams kind of like to operate?
Yeah, I would say so. And, the other part of that is, typically when you have two teams at Gillette, then they're not going to be trailing a lot. So that's not a situation they've been in a lot. But, I think if somebody gets up by 2 scores, that's going to feel a little bit bigger than maybe some of the other games where you might have, quarterbacks capable of passing for 200 yards in a game. That's not going to happen in this game. It's going to take those 12 play drives to get into the end zone. And every once in a while, there might be, a 40, 50 yard run, but there's not going to be a lot of quick strikes in this game. This is going to be a, kind of put your hard hat on and go to work. And, the game is going to happen between the tackles for the most part. So there's not going to be a ton of those explosive plays, especially with how sound these teams have been playing defensively. But, I think if you were to kind of go back to looking at the start of the brackets, I think Fairhaven and Norwell were probably going to be 2 of the more common teams. So it's not a surprise to see this matchup, but Fairhaven was just operating at a different level throughout the season. I think it took a little bit of time to get going, but I mean, you just look at their playoff scores: 44-8 over West Bridgewater, 34-6 over Stoneham, 49-20 over Bishop Fenwick, and Fenwick was the team that upset number 2 Abington, who we really were not expecting to get to the Super Bowl, but we really thought that was definitely a realistic possibility for them. So it's tough to think of a team that's playing better than Fairhaven right now, especially in Division 6.
Yeah, they've scored 40 or more points in 9 of their 12 games this year. So it's an offense that comes at you in all different angles and is as potent as one can be. I did want to shout out for the Norwell defense. These are going to be some of the names to know if there's going to be consistent stops for the Clipper defense. Dylan Verkamp, 12.5 sacks this year, 10 tackles for loss, even had a safety. Ridley McGillicuddy, kind of that bigger body in the middle, stuff in the run, 6.5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, even had a pick and a fumble recovery. And then George Bonavie as well, 10 TFLs and 6.5 sacks as well. So those guys are going to be the men, kind of in charge of stopping this Fairhaven offense at the point of attack. And this is the biggest test to date. I think Fairhaven poses a lot of threats, but Norwell has some players to cover it.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the South Shore sweep on Thursday. I'm going to go with Norwell and Cohasset. I just think they've been, they're the number 1 seeds for a reason. They've been the best teams in those divisions all year long, and I don't see that changing in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I'll go Norwell. I think they've been battle tested enough this season. I think, like you mentioned, Chris, it seems like kind of a year of destiny for them after kind of knocking on the door for a while. So I'm going to go with Norwell, but at the same time, I guess you really kind of can't discredit what Fairhaven's done the last few years is kind of they have experience, right, in the Super Bowl, been to the last three. They also had that upset win against Norwell a few years ago. So you can't undermine the experience that they have. So we'll see. But yeah, give me the Clippers.
When we did our staff prediction before the tournament, Norwell was the pick, and I'm sticking with it. But I'm just going to leave room for a little discussion as to we talk a lot about the team before the team. I think that there's a chance that Fairhaven takes this Super Bowl. Jack Lucarelli is a junior. Colin Gerhardt's a junior. There's a lot of up-and-comers that can use a game like this as memory for next year. Is this potentially the team before the team, where we're looking at Norwell next year as, okay, they're on another level compared to how they were this year? And first-year head coach Jason Pithy, has been the offensive coordinator for several years now, but first year as head coach. And Fairhaven's been here before. This is a territory that Norwell's never been in before. So we're not really certain of how a big game is going to phase a team like Norwell. So just for the sake of discussion, I think Fairhaven is, we have to give Fairhaven more credit than just saying Norwell's going to sweep here. I think there's room to discuss that this is the Norwell team before the team.
Yeah, I mean, that could certainly be the case, but we talked about experience a little bit, but there's plenty of big game experience on Norwell sideline. Jack Lucarelli, basketball state champion. A lot of those kids were on the lacrosse team, and the soccer team is pretty much, you can write them in to go to the Final Four every year. So I think some of that stuff is kind of it spreads a little bit, and it's contagious. And for some teams, I might be a little bit more worried about them being at Gillette Stadium for the first time, but I think Norwell is it's a little bit of old hat for them playing in the big games and the big stages, even if it hasn't necessarily been on the football field. But and I think there was a little bit in the semifinal when they're down 7-0 to Hudson where they got punched in the mouth, and it was time for them to see how they would respond, and you have to like the way they responded to score 21 points in a row and win that game 21-7 when it looked like they might be on upset alert, and then you look at the score and it's it looks like a little bit safer of a victory than it truly was. But I think that shows that they've got more experience than maybe you'd expect by looking at how the football team has done the last couple of years in the postseason. But again, Fairhaven, they're probably loving this conversation because they're a team that's kind of been discounted all season once Justin Marks graduated, and it was kind of like, don't forget about us, and people kind of forgot about them. And I think when we saw West Bridgewater beat them late in the season, we said, okay, they're a nice team in Division 6, but I don't think they're on the level of some of those teams at the top. And they were the most impressive team throughout the Division 6 playoffs, so it's hard to dispute what they've accomplished. But again, that should be another great game, and hopefully it stays within 7, because that's the type of game where it could be 7-0, 7-7, 14-7, 14-14, just all the way until the end. So that could be a really fun one. But on Saturday, I think across the state, potentially the two South Shore teams might be in kind of unfamiliar spots as the underdogs in this one, and it opens up with the Division 8 Super Bowl, a rematch of last year. Randolph is playing West Boylston. West Boylston is coming off a three-peat. They won the Division 7 title in 2022 and then Division 8 title in 23 and 24. So this is their 4th consecutive state championship trip. And if you look at what West Boylston's done over the last 10 years, they've essentially been the most consistent team in the state, right there with some of those big dogs in Division 1 and Division 2. And they're a team that expects to be here at this point. And going back to last year's Super Bowl, Ryan, what kind of jumped out to you in that matchup? What was kind of the difference when you look back at this one? Because, obviously this is a rematch of last year's game.
Yeah, I think it was early mistakes. They fell into a hole. I think they played a really strong second half, but at that point they were down by too much. I think they were down at, I think at one point, I think it was at least 2, if not 3 scores in that first half. So I think just, defensively, they probably gave up some bigger plays than they wanted to, but then, that kind of, didn't allow that ground and pound offense that they have, with Mekhi White and Alan Nariska and Abe Cornett. It didn't allow that to really get going. And, talking to John Marshall in their semifinal win against Neshoba this year, I think I mentioned this on the pod on our last episode, that he was like, yeah, we just made, we felt that we, could have hung with that team. We felt that we were, right there with them, if not the better team. They just didn't execute early on. So I think if Randolph can kind of come out how they did against Neshoba this year, where they took it to them, they punched him in the mouth, they scored the first touchdown, they took control defensively, they were smothering. I think just as long as they don't have one of those missteps, I think this is a team that, that now that they've been there, they've kind of gone through what it's like to be down in the hole at the beginning. I think they're going to come out, I think, with a little, I think they're going to be a little more dressed up than they were last year, now that they have that experience. And, they're undefeated. They don't want to see that. They don't want to see that end, in the Super Bowl. I think John, I think he's a great motivator for that team. And I think he's sure going to use last year's game and the way that first half kind of played out for them as motivation to come in here and get revenge on West Boylston. So, I think it just kind of comes down to how those first few minutes look and if they can execute or not.
Yeah, going back to last year's game, West Boylston was up 22-0 at halftime, and Randolph, had a chance there. They brought it within 6, 22-16, and they just couldn't get the ball back for one last drive there. So, that is one of those games where if, one or two plays goes differently in the first half, you don't really know how that one's going to play out. So, in these situations, I always love the team that lost the matchup like that. There's just, maybe more so in football than any other sport, there's something about having that little bit of extra fire in your belly that can be the difference between a win and a loss, especially in a huge game like this, and between, the two best teams in Division 8, where there's not a lot separating these two at this point. And, I think there's going to be some really fun running backs to watch in this one. Mekhi White, we've talked about all year and really for the past 3 years, and he's someone who, the bigger the stage gets, the better he plays. And on the other side, you're going to have Dominic Renzoni, who's right around the 2,000-yard mark on the season, and he played a big role in last year's Super Bowl win for West Boylston. So there's some big playmakers in this one. But how do you kind of expect this one to play out, Jason? What type of game do you see, kind of playing out in this one?
I can kind of see a little bit how it was last year, where defenses kind of control the pace, and we see Randolph, we see the scores come in, and they're like, oh, they scored 30 again. I don't think this is going to be that type of game. I think this is going to be a 2017 or 21-17, one of those sorts of kind of similar to the Cohasset thing, where I think defense is going to take the pace, and one big play near the end is going to decide it. But Ryan, I don't know if you remember this or not, but remember when we covered last year's Randolph Super Bowl and we did the interviews outside their team bus? Remember that?
Yes. Yeah, of course.
I was reading back the story that you wrote, and Alan Nariska had an interesting comment. It was towards the back end. He said, I'm very confident in my team. We're going to make it back here next year. And, I know that might be just kind of a comment made in passing, but that just leads me to believe that they've been thinking about this game for much longer than the matchup was ever decided. Like they have not been thinking about this ever since they saw the bracket come out and West Boylston's on the other side. They haven't been thinking about this ever since, the start of the regular season. They've been thinking about it since since before they even got on the bus. And it was an emotional scene, Ryan, if you remember, a lot of tears, a lot of unfinished business. And I know that's a phrase we hear often, but I think it really applies here, where this Randolph team is going to take the field with a different sort of edge than I think they did last year. And, maybe that's intangible. Maybe that is tough to quantify in terms of points and touchdowns and yards. But, I wouldn't want to stand in the way of this Randolph team right now.
Yeah, I remember that vividly, Jason, just because it was the tone in which he said it. He
Yeah.
looked at me, he was, stone faced, he was serious. He meant it. Everyone could say that after a game, but you could kind of feel in that moment that he was, genuine about it, and that they had started planning on how they're going to attack the offseason before they'd even taken their shoulder pads off, from the game. Heck,
Yeah.
before they were even off the field. So, you talk about being intangible and stuff you can't really measure, but I think in sports you have to have that, but especially in high school, with these kids, I feel like there has to be some sort of belief factor or motivation. It can't all be about the talent all the time, but I think something else that could end up coming into play here. It might not. I mean, Jason, like you mentioned, with it being maybe a 21-17, I think it could be kind of like a first to 3 touchdowns sort of deal here. But if it comes down to it, and this is a big if Randolph kind of finds itself in a hole where they're trailing again, I think they might be a little bit more equipped to do it this year, because I think this year we've seen a little bit of Abe Cornett being able to throw the ball. He didn't do it a lot last year. Jason, I think we've had a few games where I think he's been over 100 passing yards in a couple games, a couple scores, and listen, it's not a lot, but in a game where if they find themselves down, by a couple scores, and they need to kind of rely on the pass a little bit more than they need to or than they have, I think that could come into play. So obviously they'd much rather be on the other side of it where they're ahead and they can run the ball, to chew clock, but. We'll see if they, if they're down by a score or two and they need to throw the ball. I don't think it's that out of the question that they can get that done. So we'll see. I don't expect that to happen, but it's just something I feel like something to kind of monitor as the game plays out.
Yeah, I actually talked to John about that. I forget when exactly, but I asked him about Cornett. I was like, the numbers aren't super gaudy, but John said it's not a matter of strength or weakness. It's not a matter of what he's capable and not capable of doing. He's capable of ripping it down the field. It's just for this specific team and the way that they control games, it's best if Mekhi White has 150 yards and they kind of control the clock that way and they establish the lead early and depend on the run. It's just a matter of how this team is constructed, that they don't really need Abe Cornett, at least in the regular season, to go through the air and take risks. But I think you're on the money, Ryan, where that's a side of the playbook that perhaps West Boylston hasn't seen and isn't really preparing for as much as other teams would, because we haven't seen it. But I think he's capable of it 100%. I think he's got the strength.
Yeah, and you guys, kind of took the wind out of my sails a little bit, because I was going to bring up Abe Cornett as a potential X factor in this game, where maybe he doesn't have the stats of the MVP, but he'll have the 2 or 3 big plays that might have swung the game. And I think he's done such a good job the last couple of years of, even though he's the quarterback, he's a little bit of the unsung hero of the offense. He's kind of the conductor of everything, and he's not always the one getting in the headlines, but I think he's really a big driving force for their success, offensively.
Yeah. And mind you, he was a beast defensively in that semifinal against the Neshoba. I was there. He was around the ball the entire time, being on the defensive line, kind of on the edge there. So I mean, he's kind of become a two-way player, not just quarterback Abe Cornett, but sort of edge rusher, tackle for loss Abe Cornett as well. So he could be flying all over the field, at July. We'll see.
Yeah, and the other thought I had there when Jason was going on his monologue a little bit is it felt like he was kind of auditioning to be a guest speaker at about 9:45 at Gillette Stadium in somebody's locker room. But some good points there, and yeah, there is just that intangible kind of X factor that you can't really quantify of motivation. And John Marshall giving a halftime speech that just gives the players that little extra percentage to die for the loose ball, or to make that little bit of an effort play that can swing a game like this. Because I think talent wise, there's not a lot separating these two teams. So yeah, I know I keep saying it, but I think this is going to be another really exciting Super Bowl. That's going to probably come down to the fourth quarter, and it might be a situation of who has the ball last, and that's the team who's going to win. But I'm going to go with Randolph in this one. Just it feels like it's going back 12 months, it just feels like it's been an entire year of redemption for Randolph, and it's a perfect matchup for them to get a chance to beat the team that they lost to in last year's Super Bowl.
it's a hard pick to go against. I mean, despite West Boylston winning Division 7 in 2022, then ripping off 3 straight Division 8 titles in 23-24, or yeah. Is Randolph the team of destiny? That's the question. Is this, this is the first undefeated regular season that they've had this century. They followed that up with 3 postseason wins that came pretty handily. Can they finish it off? That's the big question. And I'm going to rock with them. I'm going to rock with Randolph.
Yeah, I think they can finish it off, and I think they will. I think there's just too much at stake for them to not, come out on top, in this revenge game. And then if that happens, might be great to see a grudge match, for another, matchup between the two next year. But that's down the road. We got to get through this one first. So yeah, give me the Blue Devils. I'll take them to, cap off the undefeated season and get their revenge. It's hard to pick against a team that's, made 4 consecutive trips to the state final and, won a 3-peat, but it's got to end at some point, right? And it might as well be Randolph, a team that they lost to last year.
Yeah, and wrapping up our local games with Super Bowl ties in Division 4, you've got 12-0 Tewksbury against 10-2 Scituate at 12:45. Situate's very familiar with playing at Gillette Stadium, but where they're going to be unfamiliar is I think they're going to be a relatively big underdog in this one, just based off what Tewksbury has accomplished this season. And if you kind of look across the state and you kind of look at the best public school teams in the state, I think, number 1 is King Philip, and not far behind them at number 2 is Tewksbury, even though they're down there in Division 4. Jason, you saw what Tewksbury did against Canton last week. What is Scituate up against this week?
The scariest defense in the state, maybe. This is a Tewksbury defense that was flying around against Canton. The Canton quarterback was under duress from start to finish. Tewksbury had, I believe it was 4 interceptions and could have had a couple more. I mean, this defense is playing as best as you can possibly hope for if you're a Tewksbury fan. 8 points per game to opponents. They let up double digits just 3 times this year. We know Scituate can put up points in a hurry with Johnny Donovan and Grayson Foley both having breakout seasons. Miller Shea as well as the leading receiver for Scituate. But Tewksbury's just been dominant. They've been a top 10 team in the state. Chris, I believe since maybe the halfway point of the season, if you remember correctly, like this is nothing new, is my point. And Tewksbury riding an undefeated season. Scituate might be up against it here. It's going to be a struggle. I don't foresee a 29-point lead for Scituate at halftime like it was last year. This is going to be a grinded out sort of game. And my pick, not to go against the grain here, my pick when we did our staff picks was Tewksbury. And maybe that was recency bias because I saw them against Canton and, they put up a challenge there. But this is going to be an interesting one. I'm excited to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and we spent, when we talked about Scituate all season, so much of the conversation has been around Grayson Foley, and rightfully so. He's had a monster season, but it's almost like Johnny Donovan, who's a record-setting quarterback at Scituate, has kind of flown under the radar. And to say that the quarterback who's a record setter could be an X factor in the Super Bowl is, it feels a little like a stupid point to make, but I think because of how much attention Grayson Foley has rightfully deserved this season, Johnny's kind of flown under the radar a little bit, despite being, he's been one of Scituate's best players the last couple of years. He's been at this stage before, and it feels like not that he's forgotten about, but maybe, when you're game planning against Scituate, you're thinking a lot more about the running game than you are the passing game. And that could be kind of where Scituate comes out a little differently than you expect. And I think kind of similar to Cohasset, they can win this game in a couple different ways. They don't have to rely on just one player to kind of carry them, even though, all throughout the season, Foley's been able to do that for a lot of games. But I think there's a little bit, if Johnny Donovan throws for 250 yards in this game, all of a sudden I can see Scituate kind of pulling the quote unquote upset, because I think, across the state, Tewksbury is going to be the favorite in this one. Ryan, what's kind of your take on the game?
Yeah, I think if I think if we go back to the beginning of the season, no games have been played anywhere in Massachusetts, and you say, oh, it's guaranteed that Tewksbury and Scituate are going to be in the Super Bowl. I don't think I would have taken Tewksbury, before the season started. I probably would have been like, oh yeah, Situate's going to win. They're in the Super Bowl every year. They win more often than not. It's going to be the Sailors. But I mean, just the way that Tewksbury's played, I feel like each week it's gotten to be, more and more. I feel like at one point maybe Tewksbury would have been an underdog, but then that line kept moving and moving, and I feel like now they're kind of the favorite. It's probably still would still be like a close pick 'em or something. But I mean, I think I see here that Tewksbury's outscored their opponent 410-97 this year. So I mean that's crazy. So what that tells me is that even if Scituate is going to win, which I still think could definitely happen, they're not going to win by, like you mentioned, Jason. They're not going to be up 28 points at halftime. They're not going to be up 21 points in the fourth quarter. If they do win, it's probably going to be close. I think that plays into Tewksbury's favor with that good defense that you talked about. So, I like you, Jason. I took Tewksbury in the staff picks, and I think I'm going to stick with him here. I've kind of been it seems like I've been kind of picking against Scituate all season long. It's kind of a running bit, so I might as well keep that going for one last game, right, to give them some more motivation. So I'm going with Tewksbury, but because I bet against Scituate again, they're probably gonna spite me again. So
yeah, you mentioned how dominant Tewksbury's been all season long, and maybe that's something that plays in Scituate's hand. Where if this is a close game, I mean, it feels like Scituate's been in close games all season. They had that crazy week 1 win over Westerly by 4 points. They beat Norwell by 6 points. They lost to Plymouth South on that last second play on the quote unquote catch. I don't know if that was a catch. I don't know. But it goes down as a catch, so it goes down as a loss in a 1-score game. And then, they had the competitive game against Hanover to end the season. They were back and forth with Walpole in the quarterfinals and that Duxbury game in the semifinals, even though it was a 13-point score at the end of the game. It was a competitive game, basically every snap that Scituate's been in this season for the most part has been in a competitive game. On the other side, there hasn't been a ton of that for Tewksbury, especially in the playoffs. They've dominated all their playoff games by at least 4 touchdowns so far. So, this is the type of thing where if it's close, Scituate is going to be extremely comfortable in that spot. And they've been to Gillette before. I think it's just a situation where if Scituate can keep this close, they're going to be cool, calm, and collected, whereas Tewksbury is going to be a little bit in unfamiliar territory. I mean, essentially Tewksbury's only close game this year was, I think, Methuen back in September, a really great win, a 25-21 win on September 26th. But, their closest game since then has been, 2 scores at least. And, this is a different stage. There's going to be a funky play where, a kick return gets fumbled, a face mask penalty moves a team, ends a 4th down stop. And, Scituate, that's been happening all season long. When that stuff kind of goes haywire, they're going to be very familiar there. Whereas Tewksbury, it's going to be kind of a new test for them. And, and the other side of that is, maybe it's a little stupid to say, well, you don't get credit for being in close games because you dominated everybody. But, I think there is a different level of pressure that Scituate's just going to be completely comfortable in. And for Tewksbury, it's a little bit of an unknown. So, I think that this is Scituate's probably biggest test, at least since playing Matt Festa a couple of years ago in the Super Bowl. But, I think this is going to be one of Scituate's biggest tests the last couple of years. But I'm going to go with the Sailors there to take their championship pedigree, their close game pedigree. And, if I got Johnny Donovan and Grayson Foley on my side, I feel pretty good about that matchup against basically anybody in the state.
Definitely, and for good reason. But can I make a prediction here? Is there room for kind of a little parlay, little sneaky prediction? So Herb Devine is one of the craftiest, most creative, gutsy play callers, offensive minds that we have in South Shore High School football. I think that there's going to be maybe trick plays too much of a stretch, but I think that there's going to be a play call, a funky, creative play call that's going to be like, okay, Tewksbury, like you have this renowned defense, chew on this. It's going to be, you haven't seen something like this before. I think there's going to be a little wrench. We've seen kind of unsung heroes come out of the shadows. I think Tyler Stellies had a big game 2 rushing touchdowns last week and a passing touchdown on a trick play. I think there's room for that in a game like this where this isn't going to be a normal script. Divine's going to cook something up, and I think people are going to be surprised by it. So that's my one little sneaky, you're not going to see this coming. Divine's going to cook something up.
What's the play call, Jason?
I don't like
big man touchdown, maybe an eligible lineman, on the goal line catching a touchdown, something like that.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, maybe he gave away the bag of tricks with the trick play to Johnny Donovan, catching the touchdown last week. Maybe it's going to be something different than that. I really don't know. He's as creative as it comes, though, and he's gutsy too. We've seen him, down by 1 at the goal line with time expiring, go for 2 in the win. We've seen him make gutsy calls in the Super Bowl. I wouldn't rule it out here.
Yeah, and I think there's an advantage too when you're the play caller in a game where maybe you feel like you don't have the talent edge, or that you can get a little bit more risky. You're going to go for it on, usually you punt on 4th and 4 on your own 40, but maybe you feel like in the flow of the game you got to go for it. And Herb's the type of guy who's not going to shy away from making a big call like that to try and swing the momentum of a game. So I think that's a good point too. But yeah, there's going to be a really interesting matchup. But that kind of wraps up our coverage of the local Super Bowls. But if there was of the 8 Super Bowls, you can include the South Shore games in this one. Is there a game that you guys are looking forward to the most to see kind of how it plays out?
Oh, yeah, for me, I mean, it's Division One. I feel like Division One every year is, a must watch for the most part, but especially with it, it's going to be Xaverian St. John's Prep. I think Xaverian knocked them off, last year, kind of a little bit of an upset, during the playoffs. But I think it should be a phenomenal Super Bowl. It's 2, heavyweight programs. I think, just from a straight game perspective, maybe not, anything, sort of like a Randolph or West Boylston where, Randolph's sort of getting their revenge. But, you do have St. John's Prep, looking to get their revenge on Xaverian of sorts. But I think just from a straight game perspective, it's going to be a lot of talent on that field. Obviously, with Chris Vargas at St. John's Prep, making his first, Super Bowl appearance, highly touted first 5-star quarterback recruit in Mass history, playing in the Super Bowl. It should be must-see TV.
Yeah, and they have that added intrigue of they just played on Thanksgiving and Xaverian won that 120 and 118. So you play on Thanksgiving and 9 days later you're playing at Gillette in an even bigger game. And when you look at across the state the last 5 years, these are probably the top 2 programs, especially at that Division I level. Xaverian's the defending state champs. They beat Needham last year in the Super Bowl, and they've kind of got the bragging rights right now, being the defending state champs, winning on Thanksgiving. There's going to be a lot of momentum, a lot of motivation on that St. John's Prep side. But Jason, any other games that kind of jump out to you?
Division III. I think that's going to be the other big game to watch. North Attleboro is not your everyday 7 seed. They're the defending champs. They've pulled off some really statement victories this year, and they're going up against KP. That's also no stranger to the Super Bowl stage. So I think this is going to be a battle of just big physical, run the football sort of teams. And I don't know if I don't have my pick here straight. I forget here. I picked KP for the staff pick. So this one's going to be really fun to watch, and don't sleep on North Attleboro. You see that number 7 by their name. That doesn't define them.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to go with the Division V game, another rematch. Shawshene Valley Tech is defending state champ. They're going up against Foxborough. And, Jason, you did a big story on South Shore Tech. They're kind of having their dynasty in the early 2000s. And there was a quote in there from one of the players kind of saying, I don't know if a Vogue team will ever win back-to-back Super Bowls again. And here we are a couple weeks later, and Shawshene Valley Tech is trying to do kind of the, what kind of seemed a little bit impossible in this day and age. But Foxborough is a heck of an opponent, coming from the Hockomock League. They're as battle-tested as any team in the state. We saw, what they did to Archbishop Williams, who was undefeated and flying high heading into the Division V semifinal. So that's going to be a great one. That was a great game last year. Then, the other game that we didn't mention was the Division Division II final between Catholic Memorial and Bishop Fee, 2 Catholic schools going at it. there's definitely a heavy favorite in that one with Catholic Memorial and all the history on that side. But Bishop Fien has kind of had one of their best teams in a long time. So we saw them. It seemed like it was going to be Bridgewater Random, and then Bishop Fien scored 17 unanswered points to kind of salvage their season and win the semifinal and go to the Super Bowl. So they've been counted up before and rallied back, but CM is going to be the heavy favorite in that one. But South Shore Tech and Blue Hills playing on Wednesday night in the Invada Vocational State Championship. South Shore Tech is playing Cape Cod Tech in the small school final. These teams actually met earlier in the season, and South Shore Tech won 27-6, and then I think that dropped Cape Cod Tech to 1-4, and since then Cape Cod Tech has rattled off 7 wins in a row. So it's almost like that's a game that you can kind of completely throw out the window, and it's 2 brand new teams. South Shore Tech seems to be a team that's been evolving every week this season, where there's been a couple new names that kind of pop for them. So I think that's going to be a really fun matchup. Obviously so much of the focus this week is on the MIAA Super Bowls, but going out to Greater New Bedford Voc on Wednesday to see this doubleheader, I think is definitely worth the price of admission. And then the other game starting after at 7:30 is the medium school final between Blue Hills and Tri-County. Again, a rematch. Blue Hills is the only team to beat Tri-County. They beat them 14-7 in late October. Really back and forth game, and they've split the last 2 vocational finals that they've met in. They played the last 2 years also. So a lot of history between these 2 programs, and they've always been really fun, entertaining games. And if you want to see just an absolute clinic in how to run the football, Blue Hills is who you always want to watch. I think on Thanksgiving they had 300-yard rushers. So it's every year they get a little bit better every week at running the ball, and then once you get to this time of the year, they're kind of an unstoppable force at this point.
Yeah, Ryan, you're covering one of these games, right?
Yeah, I'll be at the South Shore Tech game, yes.
Yeah, keep an eye out for Johnny Bergio. We know the name Dylan O'Brien. He was a sophomore standout last year as the leading rusher. Johnny Bergio was a guy that Mac Doyle told me he's really high on and has really come on, in the second half of the season. I believe he had a couple of scores on Thanksgiving. That's a name to watch as, I forget now if he's a junior or senior, but definitely a rising star. And I wouldn't be surprised if he finds the end zone a couple of times for the Vikings.
Yeah,
and then for Blue Hills, Chris, you mentioned the running attack. Just want to attach a couple of names. Colton Metcalf, couple of touchdown runs last week on Thanksgiving. Mikey McDonough is a name to know, and then Kane Sola, Olin Raru is another name to watch. Kind of a 3-headed monster there. Their names always end up in our roundups, and the Warriors are on a run here.
And similar with South Shore Tech and Blue Hills is I think they kind of had a little bit slow starts this season. Blue Hills really scheduled up to I think have a higher rating in the playoffs and to test themselves for this time of the year. But 2 teams that started a little bit slow, and it just feels like every week they're 2 teams that you've seen look better and better. And I think they're playing their best at the perfect time, and they're going to have some tough opponents. But don't sleep on the vocational games. If you want more football, Wednesday, Greater New Bedford Voc is a great place to be. It might be a little chilly, but there's going to be some fun football there, and those games are probably going to move quickly too. There's going to be a lot of ground and pound. The ball's not going to be in the air. There's not going to be a lot of clock stoppages in that one. There's going to be just some hard hitting between the tackles football.